collective punishment. So no matter what you think about a particular leader of a country, when you do blanket sanctions, the people who suffer are just regular people.
Right.
And here we are remembering Archbishop Romero, the people who were poor to begin with end up suffering even more. And then we end up with people losing their lives. And then we end up with people not having enough food to eat. And so we need to lift these sanctions, and I will talk to the Biden administration about doing that. On the issue of assets, you know, I am for Venezuelan assets and natural resources being controlled by the Venezuelan people.
Yes.
I mean, I think that is the way we should approach this. And it's interesting that I've been hearing that that we've had some big corporate interests that have been trying to lobby the previous administration, and I think they're trying to lobby the current administration into lifting the sanctions if they are able to purchase some of the assets that Venezuela decides to sell them. It's because it's more money for them. Our policy toward Venezuela or any other country ought not to be motivated by greed. And Venezuela and Cuba, they're not in our backyard, they're not in our front yard, they're not our yard at all. Right? So let's be clear about that. I have to tell you that my heart breaks for the Venezuelan people, as I know everybody here feels the same way. And I have never, ever acknowledged Mr. Guaido as somehow the leader of Venezuela. I am disappointed that many of my colleagues on the Democratic side have acknowledged him as somehow the legitimate leader of Venezuela. He was not elected as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. And no matter what you feel about Maduro, the deal is we all ought to agree that Guaido is not the leader, period. So let's get that clear. I will just say one final thing. I chair the Human Rights Commission in the United States Congress, and I'm worried about the human rights situation in Venezuela. I'm worried about the impact of the sanctions, and because of, by the way, many of you here, we actually did a hearing in the Human Rights Commission. We had Jeffrey Sachs as who testified, who I think made a very compelling case why these sanctions are hurting people and why that should not be our policy. So I want to thank you, because we did that because of you. But I do worry about reports of continued repression by the government. And by the way, you know, my problem with Maduro is not any socialist experiment. The people of Venezuela can decide what model of government they want and what experiments they want to embrace. I worry about when individuals, even people we disagree with, become victims of human rights abuses. And we condemn that no matter who is responsible. The UN Commissioner on Human Rights, whose own family was victimized by the Chilean government under Pinochet, has warned us that the government of Venezuela is moving in a direction that we all should be concerned about. And that's not an excuse for sanctions. It is just saying that I think we need to do all we can to urge them to respect international law as well. The other thing I'm going to say is that we ought to figure out a way in the short term to get the UN World Food Program into Venezuela. People are starving, and we ought to be able to find a way to get them in there so they can get food to people who need it. But in the long term, I am with you. The sanctions need to be lifted. This is not the way U.S. should conduct foreign policy. If we have disagreements with the governments, then we ought to sit down with those governments and talk about those disagreements. If we find that there are individuals who are guilty of significant human rights violations or mass corruption, well then you know what? Then you can target them individually. But do not issue blanket sanctions that hurt an entire population. And the final thing I'm going to say And this is why it's important, and I hope that there are others talking to the representatives all across the country. The issue of Venezuela, unfortunately, like the issue of Cuba, has become more of a domestic political issue here in the United States than a foreign policy issue, where I think decisions are being made on, votes in Florida, and not on what is the most sensible foreign policy. And the only way we change that is we help enlighten people. We help educate people. And so, we may not agree on every single thing, but the bottom line is I think we do agree that our policy toward Venezuela, one, has been harmful to the Venezuelan people. It has resulted in needless death. It has resulted in people not getting the medical supplies that, quite frankly, can keep them alive. It has resulted in food shortages. It has resulted in a lot of suffering. And that's not who I want people to think of our country as. We should be the country that, quite frankly, lifts people up. We should be the country that is there with humanitarian aid, that is there with food. And again, I appreciate you being here, and we will stay in touch. And I will follow up with the Biden administration on the issue of sanctions. I don't know what their formal policy is going to be, but we will find out. And if it's to our liking, we will thank them. If it is not to our liking, we will push them to try to change their minds. Again, I appreciate all of you being here today, and my door is always open, and hopefully we can one day actually congregate in an office together without having to worry about our health and well-being. But in any event, thank you so much.
Thank you, Congressman, for being here. I did want to ask one question just about something you said, which is, get too close, which is that you mentioned that we should target, that we should lift these sanctions. And I just wanted to ask you, are you explicitly denouncing all U.S. sanctions against Venezuela? Like, concerns aside, understanding that in practice there isn't really a difference in individual sanctions and the broad sanctions, not because of opinions on Maduro, but because of the human impact.
Well, I'll disagree with that in 1 second. I'm the author of a bill called the Global Magnitsky Act, and those are individual sanctions against individual people. For example, in China, we have Chinese officials who are responsible for the policy of mass internment camps where Uyghurs are now being pushed into forced labor. Well, I do, and I've talked to the Uyghur community, and I've seen the photograph. I believe it. But what the Magnitsky sanction is that if you are the government official who is responsible for that, or if I'm the government official responsible for that, then here's the deal. The sanction that goes against you is that all your assets in the United States are frozen, because a lot of these people are corrupt. It means that you can't come to the United States, freely, or go to Disney World or whatever. But it also means, that there's a consequence. There's a consequence when you do these things. And so
we should be more humble. We should be more humble.
Well, I'm all for being humble.
Look at the Black Lives Matter.
Right.
Look at the history of genocide in this country. We cannot.
No, but
we are not better than anybody else. We should be completely equal and respect self-determination.
No. So I think what I would just say with you is we ought to be humble. We ought to be humble. I mean, look at the shootings that are going on. Look at the police abuse. Look at our long history. Yeah, we ought to be humble. But I mean, we're here honoring Archbishop Romero, who stood up and called out human rights abuses in his own country. And we are all, no one here, I don't think, is shy about calling out our government when our government does things that we disagree with. I mean, I'm here condemning our policy toward Cuba. I'm here with you criticizing our policy toward Venezuela. But that doesn't mean that that I should be silent when the Chinese government, is forcing the Uyghur community into concentration camps, into forced labor. And by the way, one of the sanctions that I believe is that U.S. clothing companies shouldn't be buying shouldn't be benefiting from forced labor and labor camps. I mean, that's the deal. So look, I'm not here. This should never be about, we're not perfect, so we can't speak out. If we are committed to human rights, we have an obligation to speak out about human rights halfway down the block or halfway around the globe. And the bottom line is that there are people in countries all over the world, there are people in this country who are counting on you, who are counting on me and others to not be silent when they get oppressed. And that is why we're here today. So yeah, what we could do in this country is we could change our sanction policy in Venezuela. But that doesn't mean, I can't criticize a Venezuelan government official who I think is guilty of mistreating a Venezuelan citizen. But so that's all I'm saying. So I appreciate what you're saying. We ought to be humble. There's a lot, but here's the deal. Read the homilies of Archbishop Romero. They are so uplifting and so inspiring, and we ought to live his words. And I look forward to again working with all of you. As we not only deal with Venezuela, but I'm sure there's going to be other issues. So I look forward to seeing all of you.
Thank you, Congressman McGovern. I wasn't scheduled to do this, but I think that we would like to, there are some issues that we would really like to work out with you over time, so can we schedule a meeting, on the rooftop, anywhere, so we can follow up and make, lives are at stake, we need to follow up and seeing Yoav and Selena